Hello, everybody. Glad to see you all here. I will admit that some of us snuck into the room early, completely unauthorized. We're clever that way. Welcome to the Authorization Conversation. My name is Eve Mailer, and I am very delighted to be accompanied by a cast of dozens of very famous authorization people. And let me say that I know there's a lot of folks who do authorization, who sell authorization, who are authorization experts in the audience as well. And I hope that we will make this a true conversation as much as a very large gathering will allow. So I want to share with you a little bit of what I know about David and Atul and Alex and David and Omri, by sharing with you what they think they're all about. Just because we're so short on time today and we want to make sure everybody can get to the keynotes okay. So these folks are deep experts. Many of them work on at the same standards tables very collaboratively. And I want to, before we get to the sort of debate part of the show, I would like to just have a little section here where we can do a little bit of knowledge transfer, make sure everybody is on the same page. So first, I'd like to ask David Warner to share with us a little bit of the history of authorization. Like, why are we talking about this now? Where do we come from?
Thanks, Eve. So the traditional approach to authorization, from my experience, has been at that first level authorization, where authorization performed at the application level itself. And many times, the result of that authorization was cached for the duration of the user session. While that approach did provide value over time, limitations began to surface as applications modernized. One such limitation was in the consistency of authorization across applications. For example, say you have two applications, A and B. Both provide authorization access based on if a user is active. End user logs into application A, they're granted access to the application as a whole. That same user logs into application B and is denied access. How can that be? Well, those two applications have independent definition of what the word active means, therefore no consistency. But the shift towards modern applications and microservice architecture, the real need for dynamic authorization was necessary. So how do we do that? You look to use the business data to provide business decisions. The power in that gives a ultimate authorization solution for an enterprise.
Thank you. Now, there's another part of the authorization world. We're not going to be talking about star back in this session, like the differences between this back and that back, and A back to the future. I think I saw a sticker. I knew I could count on you for that one. We do want to be cognizant of the kind of the legacy and the current day standards and open source that we're presented with, because we've kind of got this modern situation with respect to all the applications. So I'm going to ask Omri to give us that situation.
Great. So first, defining the term modern authorization. What we mean by that is contrasted from traditional authorization along three axes: the what, the how, and the when. So what you're authorizing typically in traditional authorization is coarse-grained, typically at the tenant level. So you're an admin or a viewer of all the things in the tenant. How you're doing it is you're writing enforcement logic typically inside of the application, as a set of if, switch statements, and so on. And then when you're evaluating authorization rules is typically during the authentication ceremony. So you're finding out what role the person is, you stick a claim in the access token and call it a day. Whereas modern authorization is fine-grained, policy-based, real-time. Fine-grained meaning authorization at the resource level, down to the document. Policy-based meaning you're extracting all that logic out of the application and expressing it as a policy, a domain-specific language separate from the application, so externalized authorization. And then real-time meaning you're making the check right before granting or denying access to a protected resource. So with that introduction out of the way, let's talk about the modern authorization ecosystem. First, there's two centers of gravity here, what I'll call the policy as code or ABAC or PBAC world, and then the policy as data or REBAC or NGAC world. And the first one is characterized by the fact that it's focused on rich policy languages. and is largely a stateless model. Whereas the second one is much more of a stateful model, the idea of granting permissions through relationships between subjects and objects, and that's a stateful model. In terms of the standards in the space, the standards in the ABAC space go all the way back to the early 2000s with XACML, and the JSONification of XACML in ALFA. And then on the policy as data world, before there was Zanzibar, there was NGAC, a spec for NIST that talked about graphs that Alex loves, graph. And then the Zanzibar paper is not a spec in and of itself. It's not a standard, but it's a very influential architecture that has influenced a lot of implementations. And last is AuthZEN. AuthZEN was born in OpenID in October of last year. It attempts to create a big tent and unify all of these things. Today, this morning, we had the first interop event for AuthZEN with 12 interoperable implementations, so we're very excited about that. And then lastly, let's talk about the state of open source. On the left side, we have a set of projects that adhere to the ABAC world. Open Policy Agent is probably the most notable of those. It's achieved some level of ubiquity in the infrastructure space. On the right side, we have a set of implementations that are influenced by the Zanzibar spec, that these are no more than 2 or 3 years old, because Zanzibar, the paper, only was written in December or November of 2020. Then in the middle here, we have one that draws from both OPA and Zanzibar. And again, the important thing to note here is none of these things are interoperable, and AuthZEN is the first attempt to try to unify all this new innovation in the space.
Thank you both. So briefly, there's a lot of authorization going on at this conference, and that kind of got kicked off last year. Who was here last year and witnessed the sort of the birth of the authorati? Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so this is just a quick accounting of some of the other sessions. I'll leave this QR code up, and I will leave this reference to who's who up on the screen here while we can get to some commentary and opinionating, hopefully. So I want to focus on 3 big topics. And some of the debates, some of the tensions and the pros and cons around those topics. The first one is the notion of distributedness in authorization, and asking the question, what jobs should be centralized? You know, we hear in Zero Trust that it's got like a PDP and a PEP right in the Zero Trust architecture picture, so that seems to suggest centralizing, but maybe the former way of distributing everything with no communication at all is maybe not the way to go. So I'm just going to open it up to you guys. What should be centralized, and what are the reasons for that centralization, and where are the tensions? Atul? Sure.
First of all, thanks for having me. I think centralization, at least at a policy level, is very important, because as an organization, you want to, like David was saying, you want consistency across all your applications. Everything, all the data that your organization treats as their assets. And so, as long as you have centralized policies that can apply to everything, I think that is very important. I think there may be other mechanisms of achieving that same goal than doing a real-time check, but the real-time check gives you, like what we're doing in AuthZEN, gives you the most instantaneous decision, right? But you could also use something like CAPE to like asynchronously provide that information as and when needed to independent parts of your system, so that you can still have distributed evaluation, but you still have an ability to enforce central policies.
Can you just explain CAPE for anybody who isn't familiar?
Yeah. So CAPE and the Shared Signals Framework are a way of asynchronously delivering security events in general, and CAPE specifically about session-related changes. So you can say things like, "Oh, I gave you a token which had the user be able to access these things. Now I'm sending you an event saying now that user's token claims have changed, and now they can only access a fewer things, or these other things," those kinds of things.
So I'm going to challenge a little bit the notion of centralizing policy. Like I know in healthcare, one of the desiderata there is federated policy, essentially. So do you think we have sufficient standards or interoperability or infrastructure even to allow that kind of policy coming from multiple places, even if they're all in the same language?
Well, yeah. I mean, although
want to follow up on Atul's comment here. We do need a centralized store for sure, but the reality of development teams out there is a lot of them are working in silos, and you don't want to, if a development team changes the rules somewhere, you don't want to necessarily break everything for everybody. So there needs to be a bit of a trade-off there. So events can help, but also something that provides a common store would also help, like some kind of federation for sure, and something we'll be looking at in AuthZEN as well. But just to be mindful that sometimes the reality is that you cannot necessarily centralize everything.
And actually, you want to take a step back from what you were saying, Yves. I think we want to define centralization as in, is it the enforcement that you're centralizing? Is it the decision-making that you're centralizing? Is it the management of the policies, or the authoring of the policies, or the access reviews of the policies, right? If you go back to 2010, I think I was probably saying, and Jerry, you were probably saying that we want to centralize the decision-making and the enforcement. It was, the days of web services. We don't do that anymore. And I think we owe it to Open Policy Agent to have showed us that we do need to have sidecar PDPs as a pattern, and that works really well. At the end of the day, you can actually choose how much you want to centralize or decentralize. There's a lot of flexibility in the architecture. It's possible. To Atul's point, though, you do want to be able to prove that you're running the right policies, that you're actually enforcing the right sort of decisions, that you have your audit trail, so that you ultimately do want to centralize that.
I very much agree. I think I owe it to Gert, my co-founder, who came up with the phrase authorized locally, managed centrally. And the idea is that authorization is in the critical path of every application request. And so it has to be fast, and it has to be done using local data. Otherwise, you're going to blow your latency budget. Whereas you do want to centralize certain aspects. For example, you want to know what policies are running everywhere. You want to be able to control which policies are running in which applications, which distributed authorizers, and you want to be able to manage, what data, what objects, properties, relationships, attributes, and so on. So there's definitely a distributed element, and this is why authorization is so hard. It's a distributed systems problem.
So I guess the ideal system would be one where you can administer centrally and then deploy into various teams or organizations your actual enforcement. That would be kind of neat.
Exactly.
What's keeping us from this today? What needs to be done still?
Well, there are some vendors that do that.
Indeed.
Touché. I think part of it, though, is maybe awareness and education, and also, like, if you say a team within a company buys a product or adopts a product, for that matter, you don't have to have a financial transaction with it, but you then have to teach every single dev team at the customer side that there is such a thing as authorization. There's a library, there's a feature you can use. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, Dave, you've been on that journey, so you've probably hit that wall of educating people internally and saying, hey, don't reinvent the wheel of authorization.
Yeah. Sorry, may I just interject? So, I mean, to your question, Rick, what's stopping us, right? I think if you look back few decades when, we didn't have single sign-on, right, where every application was implementing their own authentication, I think we are in a similar situation right now with authorization, where every application is kind of trying to do its own thing. What standards like AuthZEN or shared signals are trying to do is making sure that there's a way to enforce, global rules on all applications and do it in a consistent sort of way.
Yeah, I was just going to echo that. That was one of our main goals when we implemented modern authorization, is make it seamless and transparent, easy for developers to integrate and use in their systems. Then they'll want to do it because it's the path of least resistance.
So, David, you'd be a really good person, actually, David Warner, to maybe comment on this. My perception has been, sure, we've solved a lot of authentication problems. That was sort of the conclusion last year at Identiverse. Is like, all right, FIDO, check. We're on to the next hardest problem. It gets a promotion. It's different in kind, though, because authentication semantics, I think everybody can pretty much agree that can sort of be a shared thing across applications. But you've a lot of specific business rules and application semantics that just differ application to application. So how did you handle this tough question, and who were the stakeholders involved that you might have had to convince?
For us, it was senior staff that got on board right away, and that was the biggest proponent of how it came to be. And there are authorization questions and answers that are at enterprise level, and then there are those that are specific application level. And it's delineating where the differences are and who can share what.
Does anybody in the audience have a question at this juncture before we switch topics? Yes, go ahead. I'll repeat the question. To embedded entitlements. The discipline of mapping authorization to embedded entitlements. Who has it is the question. Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah, go ahead, Atul.
So I think you eventually want to get away from having to do manual processes around, adding or removing entitlements altogether, right? Because you're already running your business on certain, systems of record that whether it's your ticketing system or CRM or something, where you already have the knowledge of, who's supposed to be doing what. All you need to do by way of policy is to state that under these circumstances, someone may have access to this particular type of data. And as long as you can establish that at the time of the request, whether it's like within the application or whether it's referencing a common centralized authorization system, I think you should be fine. So I would go back to the question and say, do you really need to manage these entitlements at all on a case-by-case basis?
Sorry, go ahead.
I'll add that maybe the question was worded in a RBAC biased way, and one thing you want to do when you start doing fine-grained authorizations, you just want to think in terms of plain old English, really, and let go of roles, let go of entitlements, and just write the policies in a natural way.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, one of our big things was defining user stories in English language, and that made things pretty easy, transparent, and also revert back to what I mentioned earlier. Use business data to make business decisions. There's a wealth of information across enterprises that can be leveraged.
I'm going to take one more. Go ahead.
One last point on that. It is absolutely true, though, that there are systems of record, that are very important in this space. They're kind of the source of truth for certain things. So, for example, identities tend to live in an identity provider and have potentially attributes about users, groups, group memberships. All that is incredibly important. And so your authorization system has to be able to connect to that in some way, either to be an extract database of all that data if you want to cache it locally, or to go out and retrieve that data on demand. But whatever is the case, I think you have to make sure that your authorization system is in sync with all those sources of truth.
One more, and then I'm going to take another audience question. All right.
Just because as long as you're using buckets to classify your population and assign your rights or your entitlements to those buckets, you're running into some kind of problems. And I think the problem is that our infrastructure, the tools we use are actually geared towards that. So there needs to be a kind of profound shift in even the infrastructure or the storage. And that's kind of a hurdle, for sure.
Just add one little thing. I mean, it's an
important
point. So, all I'm trying to say is the way authorization is different from authentication is once you started implementing SAML and single sign-on and OpenID Connect and all that, you never went back to using sort of your local authentication. Authorization is different because you might have use for different types of models in different scenarios, right? For the super privileged, access, you may be still okay with ACLs, right? You don't even want RBAC at that point, and you may want like ultra fine grained in some other case. So
that's a really good point, and it gets to our second topic. But I want to just have this one more question. To be honest, go ahead.
Just a quick question. We talk about policy as code and policy as data, and there's a lot of healthy debate about policy as code versus policy as data. It's like the tyranny of or. Why can't I do both?
You absolutely can. There are some implementations that do exactly both.
Just to repeat the question, policy as code, policy as data, why have to choose? Oh, there you go.
I think the truth is, tongue-in-cheek, obviously, my vendor makes an open source project that does exactly that. But to be fair to the rest of the implementations, you see a lot of the Zanzibar implementations now implement, elements of ABAC, and vice versa. You see, implementations like, XACML and ALFA be able to model relationships. You can model relationships in OPA. The question is just, kind of like whether the tools, what the tools are oriented around. Are they policy first or are they relationship first? But ultimately, I think that in real world scenarios, you really need everything.
Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. Freeze that moment. The second topic is, I think, related to what Atul was just talking about. I think of it as temporality. So the timing of certain things, the caching of certain things, the staleness that certain things get, certain artifacts get in the process. And so there comes a question, and I think you were sort of suggesting this makes it a little bit different from authentication, which has this natural relationship to the end user and so on. So what should you really be doing always or sometimes at admin time, at runtime? Is there some other time we should be thinking about? And how does that impact the quality, the assurance, I'm going to call it, the authorization assurance? Where's Jeff Lombardo? He talks about, what was it? Yeah, there he is.
I'd love to jump in on this one. I think that there are some things that are, if you look at your organization, you have users. Users tend to be in groups. And that tends to be something that people think of as admin time, right? So think about, like, we have a Google Workspace. We have users that are inside certain groups, and we want to use that group membership as part of our authorization system. And at the same time, you then have application-specific things. You have a set of types, that each application has. Those types may have relationships. Those relationships carry permissions. And so kind of bringing those things together, I would say that, there are some things like, group membership that feel like admin time things. And then some things that, like you have to basically do at runtime. So the idea of like whether, this user has permission on this document really involves saying, does this user, is this user a member of this group? Does this group have read access to this folder? Is this document as part of this folder? So it's really a combination of things that you've configured in admin time and things that are like much more dynamic.
Yeah.
I want to add that if you look at like zero trust and the definition of zero trust, they say, I don't remember the wording, but something along the lines, always verify, So continuous access, to use the terminology, you use a tool. And I think in the theory of externalized authorization and ABAC, you always want to ask, hey, can the user do this? Can the user do that? Can they get access to that resource? The reality is a little more complicated because that has a cost, right? But bear in mind, your app has a cost as well, right? Doing authorization within your app has a cost. You just don't see it. Externalizing it, you see it. But then you start having to think about like how expensive is it to go fetch the relationship between a user and a piece of data, or the spending limit, or so on and so forth. And that's when you have to have conversations about caching the data that you need for the decision-making process, or caching decisions potentially within the app to make your system perform to the degree that you want to have it perform.
I think if you think about it in the sort of 3 C's, like Gartner puts it, like, continuous, contextual, and consistent. I think that you always want to be consistent in your decisions because you don't want the same data to be accessed in one way and not in the other way, right? But then how much context do you want at every decision varies, and sometimes that might be a lot, sometimes that might be nothing, so that you can deal with static rules. And then how much continuity do you want? Like how dynamic is that context changing? How dynamically do you want to update the permissions? That sort of determines how fine-grained and how dynamic you want to make the decisions.
So I just wanted to get back to the original question of the timing. So a lot of people are still doing authorization at authentication time, right, where you stuff in all kinds of things into your access token at login time. And what we're talking about is not doing that, but rather doing that for every single request. The problem with stuffing your token and leaving it there is that eventually, if your access gets revoked, well, how do you know? You need something like CAPE to sort you out. But if you don't have something like CAPE yet, you might grant access where access should not be granted. The zero trust philosophy, never trust, always verify, is basically to authorize every single request. And I think that's where we should be heading as an industry.
So, but that brings up a question. So you've touched the OAuth topic, and we haven't really talked to OAuth so much. I know we are mutually sort of passionate about this particular topic here, but there's a lot of sort of micro-timing things that you get into with an access token, with a refresh token, with the forever God token that gets issued in a lot of cases, with the abuse of scopes to do, sort of unnatural authorization acts. So, what are the barriers here to doing a better job of having the freshest possible data and making that still be performant given the reality of how people are used to working with OAuth. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. Go for it.
All right. So since I have the mic, but yeah, I think that you need to make a decision about sort of what is the use case and how much context and how much dynamism it needs, and then decide what you can do with just OAuth or what you need to do using AuthZEN or Cape with that.
Yeah, real quick, just the time, response times or the time it takes, it's a tricky conversation. Even if you stuff your token with all kinds of things, if you need to revoke the token or refresh it, that's going to take some time. So bear that in mind.
Yeah, and it all depends on the use case, right? So this morning at the AuthZEN event, we had somebody who asked that very question. He's like, okay, well, so why can't I just put a, kind of a scoping and access token and call it a day? Well, if, your level of granularity is admin and user, yeah, you should do that. That's reasonable. That's simple. And obviously modulo the revocation issues, which is still an issue, it's still a security issue, that you may be able to get away with that. But let's say you're Google Docs and, you're logging in a user. Are you going to really find out what documents that user can access, read access to at authentication time? When there are thousands of documents? And even if you could, even if that was reasonably bounded in terms of time, are you going to stuff all those claims in an access token and call it a day? As soon as you mint that access token, it has a lifetime. And so it's out of date, at the very second that you've actually minted. So that model just doesn't make any sense when it comes to that type of authorization, fine-grained authorization. And that's why fine-grained and real-time really go together, right? And that's why you really need an externalized authorization system if you're trying to do all of that. So that's why these things are all related: fine-grained, policy-based, real-time.
And to go back to your question, Yves, when are we going to see that shift? I think part of the reason why OAuth has been so successful to deal with authorization is that it's a one-sided product, one-sided equation. It's just about identity, and it hangs off of the user, and you don't really need to know what the application is, and at best you need to know the scopes, and that's that. You don't need to get intertwined with the app code. Whereas in authorization, somehow you need to find a way to get a hook into the application and do the authorization that way. Now, take for example, I would love to solve the Salesforce authorization challenge, which means that Salesforce. I'm picking on Salesforce, but it's true of any rich SaaS. So any CRM, Workday, you pick your poison. And today, all these SaaS products, they offer a means to do SAML or OAuth, so you can plug in your authentication. Great. But they don't offer a way to externalize authorization. Why not? Well, because you'd have to hook into the web UI, and don't forget the APIs. At least the APIs would be easy. You can slap an API gateway in front of your APIs and do authorization that way. But the UI becomes a backdoor. And that's true of, say, SharePoint Online and all these other systems. And getting those big elephants to redesign their products so that you can fully externalize authorization from those apps with a model that has been built over 20, 30, 40 years is really, really hard.
I'm just going to invoke moderator's privilege here and make a comment, because I've long thought that scope-grained access, which is a kind of grain, but it's not super small, it's been abused, but it also reveals to you certain characteristics of the grain of the resources that you want to access. There's a lot of for pay APIs that hinge on scopes. So if anybody wanted to invent scope infrastructure to do more there, it might be really interesting. I don't mean to suggest it as...
Yeah, and you can also combine these models, right? In the sense that a policy can reason about scopes in an access token as one of the pieces of context. And that can actually be a migration path, right? So a lot of folks say, well, I don't have access to 1,000 applications. I can't really modify each one of them. How do I get started? Well, the authentication ceremony is one of the control points you have. The API gateway is another control point that you have. So you don't necessarily have to evolve every single one of your applications in order to move to a fine-grained model in an evolutionary way.
The only place sorry, I'm just jumping in here, but
Good.
The only place I think the AuthZEN still has a place is where user interaction is involved and when you need consent. And I'm sure that's a subject close to your heart, Yves, with Uma and the like.
Yes, what do they call it up here? Systems of engagement around permissions, yes.
That's right. So
and collecting self-asserted information, right, that you need to know.
Yeah, so that's, I think, where that OAuth dance is still valuable, because actually that interaction is pretty much well scripted and described. Other than that,
So David Warner, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on the whole temporality question, and what you had to sacrifice or what you didn't have to sacrifice.
Yeah, and part of it is the metadata about the information being used in the authorization. How good is it how long is it valid for before it's refreshed, and how long is it valid for before it should be inactivated? That's really what we
Did
came
you
across.
struggle with revocation infrastructure?
It was more of a discussion about how long things are valid for.
Okay, so timing out versus a push. Okay. Any questions from the audience on this subject before we move to our last topic? Yeah.
I think nobody actually answered the gentleman's first question, but David brought it up, which is there's legacy applications that have their authorizations totally internalized. SAP, you've got T codes, yada, yada, yada. I think the question was, how can I use my policy engine to make SAP behave in a dynamic,
Okay, to repeat, how can I use modern authorization to apply to SAP and get it to be dynamic and fine-grained and all the rest, right? Okay.
There's two ways, I think. The first way is to go back to the PEP PDP architecture and somehow find a way to put a PEP, a gateway, an interceptor in front of what it is you want to protect, SAP. But kind of like what I said with the Salesforce example, if you have API access and UI access, are you going to start parsing HTML to understand what you're dealing with? The PEP is not going to work in that use case. So, and I'm sure with SAP it would be the same. And of course, when we say SAP, it's a brand, right? But they have hundreds of apps behind the scenes. So we got to be more specific. The other way, though, is to do provisioning. Can you somehow convert your policy language and your configuration and your graph into the bits and bobs understood by the target application? So SAP, I'm sure, has a very rich authorization model. If they do expose a means to provision configuration to that authorization model, and if you can find a way to convert your stuff, be it ALFA or Open Policy Agent, into that target system, then that's a way to address the authorization.
I think in the real world what we see is when you don't have access to the source code, as in SAP, there are really two control points. The authentication ceremony. So, Alex, you're right. We don't want authentication to be the place where we do authorization, but oftentimes identity and access teams, that's all they got. And then the second place is the API gateway. And as David says, that's fraud. You're super tightly coupling, any logic that you put in the API gateway to whatever the model is of the target application, the relying party. And anytime that contract changes, your API gateway, is not going to work anymore. And so there really is no substitute. Think about the old world of SSO. People were trying to do SSO with Salesforce in 2005 or 2007. It didn't support it, right? So you could do all these hacks. But ultimately, it wasn't until it supported SAML and OpenID Connect that you could actually have it join the family. You got to reach a tipping point. We're not yet there with authorization. We're not at that tipping point. We can all probably confidently say that. But that's what we're trying to get to. And OpenID AuthZEN is one of the steps there. As soon as you have a framework that you can say, look, vendors, you can target that. And you can actually now work with 12 interoperable implementations and hopefully more. All of a sudden, you now, I think, start building momentum towards getting there.
Yeah, just to add to what Omri was saying, I think there's this new notion of, it may be not so new, is of event time processing, right? So instead of, and like David was saying, that you can use some APIs that the application provides, like SAP provides, to manage their provisioning, right? Manage the permissioning of that application. But you don't have to do that all up front. You can do it in response to certain events. So let's say you receive an SSF event to modify someone's permissions, and SAP does not support SSF. So what you do is, at that time, doing event time processing, you modify the SAP native permissions in order to give you what new revised permissions that you want. This was actually very eloquently put in a blog by Ian Glazer recently, Event Time Processing. I forget the name of the title of that blog.
I Actually, I don't know if some old-timers here remember PeopleSoft, but that was an event-based engine, actually. So the idea has been around for a long time, and all we're talking about really here is how to do the PEP part of the whole thing. So the PEP is really the question here. What can do that?
It seems like the more dimensions of time that we can control, the better, right? So admin time, runtime, login time, event time is kind of maybe the innovation that's back from the future, back to the past. Anyway.
Back to the future.
Yeah, there you go. So there's one other sort of big topic that I want to address, and we're continuing down the geekiness rabbit hole here, I think. Has to do with statefulness. And, when we're talking about systems where you've got, multiple independently developed entities communicating, you need to coordinate who holds the state and how and for how long and for what purposes. So what are the issues with kind of the different sides of all these authorization interactions, and where are the challenges?
Okay.
I'm first.
Sure. So authorization is a data problem. I mean, you could write the enforcement logic in whatever policy language. We could debate till we're blue in the face which policy language we want to use. But ultimately, it's a data architectural problem, because you need to figure out how you're bringing data to the engine. You could bring data to the engine either as part of the request. You can store the data as part of the policy. OPA calls this data.json. You can call out from the policy to an external data source like a pip. Or you could basically kind of have some kind of embedded structure, like Zanzibar systems, which define specifically a data model for how that data is laid out, potentially objects, their properties, and relationships. Those are kind of like the 4 tricks that we have in our tool bag. And ultimately, each one of them has pluses and minuses. So if you're calling out from the policy, you'll only have one source of truth, sure, but you may have latency issues and you may have availability issues. And the more external data sources, the more you're risking to default closed. Because if one of those things doesn't come back in the right time frame, you have to deny, right? On the flip side, if you want to cache everything locally, that's great. You have lightning fast authorization. On the other hand, you may not have the freshest data. So you have to invest in making sure that you constantly, make that data that's cached fresh. So there's really, kind of no magic here. You have to make decisions, architectural decisions around what you want to optimize for.
You got a head nod out of me and about 50 people sitting right around here, so it seems like you laid some truth out there. Yeah. So Alex first, I think.
That was a good explanation, Omri. But some models use data itself as policies, whereas others use code as policies. And indeed, it's a decision. But if you use data as policies, then you don't necessarily need code either. So just wanted to make that distinction. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Say a little more.
Yeah. So we use graphs, and in a graph, the data itself serves as the policy, because we look for paths in the graph, and it's always the same rule essentially. We look for a path between the subject and a resource. So if we model the data in such a way that we can always find that path, then it's pretty easy. We don't have to write rules. It's always the same rule. We just have to model the data. So then the data becomes the policy. And now you have a stateful system, but at least you have all the data there, and you have to keep it fresh, as Omri said. So pros and minuses, but at least once you have this graph data, I mean, I'm really ready to bet that more people should be able to use it, because it's really easy to understand the graph. You can read it in plain English as you see it. So it opens up some possibilities. So
I admit that the trick that I do in my mind when I think about what you get out of a graph is it's a representation of reality. So it's a map, and it's an abstraction, and you can derive policy-relevant insights from it, I guess. But it actually does many different jobs, and it has all of the, I suppose, the pluses and minuses of how graph is managed and traversed and everything else. But it's not policy itself. It's just some facts. Am I right about that? Is that
Yeah,
a crazy way of
absolutely.
thinking about it?
Yeah, graph data becomes knowledge. It's not data anymore because the semantics attached to everything. So now you deal with knowledge. It's kind of a paradigm shift, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we love the graphs because, we also do the same thing. But I mean, one of the key things I wanted to bring out in this discussion, and thanks, Omri, because what you said is absolutely right. It's always stateful because authorization decisions are always going to be influenced by the data. And so the balance that you have to seek between sort of the most current data and, being able to answer quickly, right? That I think can be achieved very well with a graph, and the human readability of those policies is very important. What the graph does, which I think haven't seen anywhere else, is the ability to correlate different data sources into one data structure, right? And that's what makes those policies more readable, is because you can now correlate a user in CRM with a user in your ticketing system and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. If you look at very general purpose engines like OPA, for example, it has no opinions, right? It's just an input document, a data document, it's just JSON. When you start structuring that data, you start getting a lot of ancillary benefits. Take the Zanzibar model, which is just the RDF model. You have subjects that are connected to objects through predicates, basically through relationships. You can answer questions like, what users have a read permission on this particular object? Or you can answer questions like, for this user, what objects of type foo does this user have write access to? And all of that is a graph evaluation in the same way that does this user have this permission on this object is. Basically, that kind of holds a lot of power, what we call search APIs. And so, like whatever you're doing, whatever engine you're using, having a data model to organize your data, and especially if it's a graph model, gives you a lot of power to do things that are, I would say, kind of not exactly authorization, but close cousins to authorization. For example, filtering. You're logging in, you want to see what, purchase orders this user has access to. That's, like not specifically an authorization problem, but it's a related close cousin. And almost everybody that wants to solve authorization also wants to solve filtering.
So I want to make everybody have quick answers because I want to get one more question from the audience.
I'll just second what Omri said. Very true. Like the first thing you think about is the binary authorization. Hey, can the user do X? But very quickly you enter the realm of filtering and masking and redacting. And one thing we're doing within the AuthZEN working group within OpenID Foundation is so we have that first version, which is the binary authorization, but soon enough, probably by the end of the year, we're going to tackle what we call the search challenge, which is essentially data filtering.
Thank you for making that brief. So Travis has a question here. Ooh, there's a good lightning round question. Tipping point by 2034? Just go right down the row. Yes, no. Where externalized authorization becomes a thing.
Very quickly, Gartner said that by 2020, 80% of companies would be doing ABAC. So,
so no.
Gartner also said by 2025, most 80% of data will be in graphs. So,
you guys are all arguing against interest here.
So I'll be the contrarian here. I think that it took us probably 15 years to get that tipping point from when we first started talking about single sign-on for the web until we actually had, kind of the, OpenID Connect moment of ubiquity. Let's call it 2014, 2015. I think we're, probably like by 2034, I'm pretty confident that we're going to reach a point where externalized authorization is the preferred pattern. And, we may not have boiled all the oceans and solved all the world's problems, but I feel pretty confident that externalized authorization will happen by then.
Okay, Atul?
Let me note that Travis is shaking his head vigorously. But yeah, what I would still say we will be at the tipping point, but not in maybe the way we expect. I don't think we can overhaul all the applications and sort of get there. I think we have to bridge to what the applications currently support and figure out a way to get the consistency, get the centralized management, and the most current decisions into the applications the way they support it, right? And some will change, some will not. But I think because we are all interested in solving the problem, we'll find a way to do it.
So David Warner, last word. Oh, I think everybody answered.
I just say we should take bets.
Yeah.
I was going to say,
Come on,
yeah,
we'll do
I think we'll get there. I've seen it throughout my career. I don't think it's a solution for everything, but I think majority will get there.
Thank you, guys. Thank you to the audience. Sorry I didn't get to all the questions. And see you at the keynotes.